U.S. History Unit 14. So this picks up where your Volume 5 of your textbook ends. Volume 5 of your textbook ends kind of like this: Ronald Reagan just got reelected to a second term. What's going to happen with the Cold War? Yeah, so there's a lot that has happened since then. Um, there is a volume six, but for a variety of reasons, some of it not having a six volume for you to read, some of it just the cost of getting a volume six without getting full sets and everything. That yeah, so I just cover this stuff instead of you having reading assignments. In most years, when we're not doing any reading assignments during the last maybe about month of the school year, you are reading that Cornelius Ryan World War II book, The Longest Day. But again, to kind of lighten your load and space things out a little bit more here in the fourth quarter with the school at home kind of stuff, we are not reading that book. But yeah, so well, I'm planning on doing two videos here on Unit 14. You will not have a separate Unit 14 test, and some of this information will be on your final exam. And as usual, I have a handful of questions that I'm planning to ask throughout this video. And here we go. So these numbers are from your final exam study guide. You do have a copy of that, but it has the section 1985 to the present, and I forget how many terms. I think something around like 44 terms, something like that, 45 terms maybe, of highlights of that time frame, 1985 to the present. So I'm just going to go through those, and that'll be the way that we cover the material. So the first thing is the Iran Contra affair. This happened during Reagan's second term as president, and it's a scandal that happened because there are a variety of illegal things that were going on. So there's Iran in the Middle East, right? So, I mean, that's generally the Middle East right there. Iran would be right around here, just northeast of Saudi Arabia. So most of that's the Saudi Peninsula, Saudi Peninsula, I think. And then with Saudi Arabia on it is the main country on it, and then northeast of that is Iran. And then it also involves this Central American country of Nicaragua. And that's your video question number one. Video question number one is: where is Nicaragua? Where is the country Nicaragua? And the answer is Central America. Central America. So you have South America, North America, and then mainly on this isthmus here, you have Central America. Anyway, so what was happening was this: Iran was under an arms embargo. What that meant was Congress had passed a law that said that the United States could not sell weapons to Iran. But even though Congress had said, United States, you cannot sell any weapons to the country of Iran, the United States was secretly supplying them with arms. And it involved using, if I recall correctly, Israel as a back channel of like, we're kind of like pretending to sell weapons to Israel, but actually at a discounted price. And then they sell the weapons to Iran at the full price. And then we end up getting the money for it. But we're not really registering that money because, and here's the next part, the U.S. was secretly supplying them with arms. Justification was to help release seven American hostages. So Iran was holding seven Americans as hostage. The some officials in the Reagan administration were trying to get those hostages released, and they felt that if they could supply Iran with weapons, then that would be a negotiating chip for getting these hostages released. Then the money that they were secretly getting from the secret sale of these weapons, they were sending along to an anti socialist group called the Contras in Nicaragua. And guess what? Congress had also prohibited funding them. So the Reagan administration was violating Congress's orders by selling weapons to Iran, and they were violating Congress's orders by giving money to the Contras in Nicaragua. And eventually, information started to get out about that, and yeah, that's the main scandal that was happening in the Reagan administration that I'm aware of. Okay, number two, the Challenger explosion. This was 1986, and this was a space shuttle launch. And what happened was the space shuttle broke apart 73 seconds after takeoff. and it was, you have like CNN live in that picture there. It was a live televised broadcast. Especially a bunch of students in school were tuning in to watch the broadcast live. One of the reasons why is because one of the astronauts on this was a teacher, and there was a kind of a national contest to get a teacher to get to go up into space on the space shuttle, and so a lot of schools were aware of it because of that. And yep, the thing, a little over a minute up, it just, there was a big boom and it broke apart. And the problem was there were some O-ring seals that got too cold. These like rubber seals that help control what happens with the fuel. And there were reports and everything that had pointed out that, hey, if the temperature gets too cold, these can get brittle. And if we try to launch while these things are in a brittle condition, it those seals might break and it could cause catastrophic problems. And even though that was a known risk, there's like the launch had gotten postponed a couple times, and the the space program had been a huge success for so long without glitches, and there were some engineers who had raised concern of what might go badly, but their concerns had gotten kind of brushed under the rug, and they had gotten hushed, and it's like, no, 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 nothing bad like that is going to happen, and yes, this is a risk, but we've already postponed a few times. And yeah, all 7 of the crew members ended up dying, and it should not have happened. NASA and a lot of organizations learned a lot after that about how you do have to keep paying attention to things, even if it's like not a popular thing that you want to consider at the time. At Cape Canaveral, there's a Kennedy Space Center where they launch, and there's a big museum of space flights and everything like that that's there, and it's really, really um, chilling slash gripping slash emotional. You're going through the different displays about the different space shuttle missions, and then you kind of turn a corner into a room, and it's this dimly lit room, and what is right there in front of you, behind a glass and in a display case, is the windshield that they ended up recovering from this space shuttle, and also a part of the spacecraft that survived that had the United States flag on it, and then you see the biographies of the different the different astronauts who died, and yeah, it was a very tragic event. Number 3, the Exxon Valdez. This was an oil tanker in 1989. The oil tanker spilled off the coast of Alaska, just millions and millions and millions of gallons of oil. And it's the worst oil spill to date in terms of damage to the environment. And yeah, I'll just leave that at that. Numbers 4 and 5. These relate to the end of the Cold War. I think number 4 is the fall of the Berlin Wall, and number 5 is the end of the Cold War. Depending on who you talk to, those are the same thing, or they're two separate things. So what happened in 1989? The Berlin Wall came down, and yeah, you have a picture there of people celebrating and rejoicing and mingling sides. There are others of like people taking sledgehammers to it as the Soviet Union officially allowed Berlin to get rid of the wall. There's still sections of it that are standing. I've been in Berlin, and the sections that they left were kind of a memorial of what happened, and different graffiti artists kind of do social commentary kind of stuff, usually graffiti on some of the sections of it that are left. But then in 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved, and that's what the other thing is that some people consider as being the official end of the Cold War. Moving on. Number 6, Bill Gates. So he's on here because Bill Gates had the biggest influence on turning the world to a place where an average person had a computer in their home, at least average American. And he founded the company Microsoft in 1975, and then Microsoft Windows came out in 1985 and has revolutionized personal computing again from the standpoint of It was computers that were running Microsoft Windows that were the computers that started to show up in people's houses all across the country. And personal computing for doing things like using your dial up modem to get online, to get some news, or to send an email, or to wait a very long time to download a picture, stuff like that. Uh, yep, that's because of Bill Gates. Uh, some would try to make a case for um, Steve Jobs with Apple, but Apple was a bit later and had a different influence. The smartphone revolution owes itself to Apple, but personal computers owes itself primarily to Bill Gates. Okay, number seven, George H.W. Bush. Not to be confused with George W. Bush, his son, who became president later. This is George H.W. Bush. Fascinating story from the standpoint of was in the Navy in World War II. After World War II, he got married, then he went to Yale. While he was at Yale, he was a first baseman on the Yale's college baseball team, and he played in the first two college World Series as their first baseman. And after that, he got elected to the U.S. House of Representatives and then was an ambassador to the United Nations. He was the United States ambassador to the United Nations. And then he was the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. And then he was vice president under Reagan. And then he was elected president. And it was his administration that saw the end of the Cold War and that also saw the Persian Gulf War. So the Persian Gulf War will come up with number nine. I feel like, let's see, what was my. I'm just double checking. I went back one slide. Sorry. Okay. Number eight is the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. I'm omitting that, but basically, it was a treaty with the former Soviet Union for reducing the number of nuclear warheads that we had. So at the time, at its peak, there were enough nuclear bombs between the United States and the Soviet Union to destroy all of life on Earth like two and a half times, something like that. Number nine, the Persian Gulf War. So this was 1990 to 1991. And what happened was Iraq invaded the country of Kuwait. So here's Iraq, kind of couched right between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Iraq invaded Kuwait, and Kuwait was one of the big oil distributors, oil suppliers for the United States and several other countries. And that's one of the reasons, as well, is just not cool, bro. You shouldn't attack the countries near you like that. And so, as a result of that invasion, the United States, the United Kingdom, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and France joined forces to fight against Iraq. And it didn't last very long. It was a fairly quick war of driving the Iraqi forces back into Iraq to liberate Kuwait. One of the unique things about this war is it was one of the first wars to have live, it was the first war to have live news broadcasts from the front. And so the war and images of the war, especially like Scud missiles, the light from missiles and rockets and tracer bullets and stuff like that, lighting up the night sky, all of that was stuff that people saw regularly almost every night on the news. On the side that the United States was on, there were a total of 292 killed. On the Iraqi side, around 25 to 50,000 killed. So it was a very effective war from that standpoint. There was some debate about whether or not to continue on trying to do anything against Iraq, but the war ended with okay, Kuwait has been liberated. All right, that's it. When Iraqi troops were leaving Kuwait, they set on fire a bunch of oil wells. And oil burns well, no pun intended. Um, and we're talking super, super hot flames that are very dangerous and very hard to put out. There's a fascinating documentary that was done for IMAX that was done about the crews whose job it was to cap, well, to put out the flame and then put a cap on the well to keep it from reigniting. And yeah, really, again, fascinating documentary. Number 10, Rodney King, that led to the LA riots, also known as the Rodney King riots. So what happened was this: the year was 1991. Rodney King had been hanging out with some friends, and he and a few friends were driving around 12:30 a.m. on I-210 near LA. And a husband and wife CHP team, California Highway Patrol, they saw him speeding and went to pull him over. He refused to pull over because he was driving under the influence, and he knew that a DUI would violate the terms of his parole, where he was on parole for a previous robbery conviction. So he didn't pull over, he decided to flee. And the chase capped out at 117 miles per hour. Multiple cop cars ended up getting involved. They finally got him cornered, and when they got him cornered, he was not wanting to get out of the vehicle. He finally exited the vehicle, and there were a couple instances where, well, yeah, there was a brief scuffle as they were getting him out of the car, and the officer in charge had made sure that all of the other police officers there holstered their weapons, and then they did a swarm technique, which is where a group of them would circle around the person that they were trying to subdue and would come in and approach him all at the same time and then try to get the person down to the ground. And they did that once, and he was able to buck two or three of them up off of his back when they were trying to get him down. And something like that happened a couple of times. So at that point, the orders were to use their nightsticks, their batons, and to use a type of blow to try to get the person to stay down on the ground. And there was a nearby person who videotaped it, and that recording ended up getting out of multiple officers surrounding white officers surrounding a black guy and beating him with their nightsticks. And there were four officers who were charged with assault and with use of excessive force. There was a court case. All four were acquitted, so found not guilty of the assault. One was found guilty of use of excessive force. The jury, though, had nine white people, one biracial person, one Latino, and one Asian American. So note there are no black people on the jury. And that was one of the big reasons why, when the officers were acquitted, there were riots in LA. And in the course of those riots, 63 people were killed, almost 2,400 were injured, over 12,000 people were arrested, and there was over $1 billion of property damage that was done. It's one of the sad things about riots like this when they happen is it's African Americans predominantly rioting about an injustice that they see regarding other African Americans, but the rioting takes place in African American, high percentage African American parts of the city, which is, it seems kind of ironic and not to make sense to destroy a bunch of property of when you're trying to protest injustices to people of your ethnicity. And anyway, but yeah, those are the LA riots, also known as the Rodney King riots of 1992. Number 11, Bill Clinton. So he had been the Attorney General of Arkansas and then the Governor of Arkansas. And he defeated George, oh, that should be H.W. Bush. Sorry about that. And one reason why he defeated Bush, so H.W., he won one election. So Reagan served two terms. So Reagan were the 80 and 84 elections. Then the 1988 election, Bush won. Then the 1992 election, Bush lost. And one of the big reasons George H.W. Bush lost the election was he had made a campaign promise when he won in 1988, and the campaign promise was that he would not approve any new taxes. And like in particular, he said it in a campaign speech along the lines of Congress is going to come, they're going to ask for new taxes, and I'm going to say no. And then they're going to come again and they're going to ask for new taxes, and I'm going to say no. And then they're going to come again, they're going to try to pass new taxes, and I'm going to say this: read my lips. No new taxes. Well, during his term as president, Congress did try to pass new taxes, and he did a good job at first of telling them no, but Democrats had control of both the House and the Senate, and Bush ended up negotiating with them and passed some new taxes. And everyone who was campaigning against George H.W. Bush in that 1992 presidential election really pointed out the fact that he said, "Read my lips, no new taxes," and he signed some new taxes into law. And that is your video question number two. Video question number two is, what was George H.W. Bush's campaign slogan? And the answer is, "Read my lips, no new taxes." Read my lips, no new taxes. So again, that's video question number two. So back to Bill Clinton. So Bill Clinton, he was a Democrat from Arkansas, and he served 2 terms. So he was president. Well, he was elected in 1992. So he served president from 1993 through 2001, beginning of 2001, and big economic expansion. And it's one of the things that a lot of liberals like to point out, that look, Bill Clinton raised taxes, he increased the tax rate on people, and guess what happened? The economy did great, and government paid down a bunch of its debt. And well, there were a lot of other things happening at the time. In particular, one of them is something called the .com boom, where the internet was taking off, and along with that, online companies, and it was just huge economic expansion because of all of the internet companies that were becoming, I mean, computer and internet companies that were getting huge. There were some other factors as well. Savings rate of Americans, and how many of the baby boomers were people who were born just after World War II, because a bunch of servicemen got back from World War II, and there were a lot of babies born. And anyway, yeah, a lot of baby boomers still working. So bunch of things like that. One of the key characteristics of Clinton's presidency was his impeachment. So he was one of now 3 presidents to be impeached. Andrew Johnson was impeached just after Abraham Lincoln, and then Bill Clinton was impeached, and then Donald Trump was impeached. And to be impeached again is for the House of Representatives to officially say, "We think you might have done something illegal, and you should be tried by the Senate. We are officially accusing you of potential wrongdoing." And what the wrongdoing was in the case of Bill Clinton was he had had an affair with a White House intern named Monica Lewinsky. And at one point, under oath, he was asked questions about it, and he lied about it. And so, lying under oath is what is known as perjury. And so, he was impeached for perjury, impeached for lying under oath, and the Senate ended up letting him off. All right, number 12. Do I have the okay? Good. It's like, do I have the year here? Yeah, number 12. This is the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas. The Branch Davidians, they're a cult offshoot of Davidian Seventh Day Adventists, and they had this whole compound in Waco, Texas, and you know, people claiming to be like, well, in particular, David Koresh, who ended up gaining popularity. He was saying that he was the Lamb from the Book of Revelation, and that the Lamb was not Jesus, that he was the Lamb from the Book of Revelation, who was like the promised one to come before the second coming. And there was a prophetess that they had there, and the just all sorts of heresies and problems. A lot of sexual promiscuity, especially from those like claiming to be prophets. And yeah. Anyways, well, what happened? Part of what happened is there's more to the story involving like one guy who got ousted, got kind of kicked out of the group, and how he tried to get the FBI to investigate the other guy who was in charge, and yeah, stuff like that. Anyway, 1993, the Bureau of ATF. So ATF is alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. The Bureau of ATF, they attempted to search the compound based on sexual abuse and illegal weapons allegations. And when alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, um, when they went to conduct that search, the Branch Davidians fought back. The result of that was 4 ATF agents were killed, 16 ATF agents were wounded, and 6 Branch Davidians were killed. Then, because of that, the FBI took over instead of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. And the FBI was able to negotiate the release of 19 children from the compound. The children there was evidence that they had been physically and sexually abused. Then, on April 19th of 1993, at the end of a 51-day siege, so the FBI got those 19 children released toward the beginning of surrounding the compound and not letting anyone in or out and having armed personnel on hand, stuff like that. But at the end of that 51-day siege, the FBI decided to forcibly raid the compound. And there was a fire, and the evidence is somewhat unclear. There were a few that claimed that the FBI started the fire. Most of what we can tell appears that it was some of David Koresh's own people within the Branch Davidian complex that set the place on fire. Basically, like, rather than get caught, we're just going to set the place on fire. And the result of that fire was 76 of the 85 Branch Davidians who were still there died, and most of them died from falling rubble and suffocation. And let's have as video question number 3. What does ATF stand for? What does ATF stand for? And the answer is alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. Alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. Number 13, Oklahoma City bombing. So there's a guy named Timothy McVeigh and another guy. They met in some kind of survival training, I think, related to the military. Anyway, another guy named Terry Nichols. They really did not like how the FBI handled the 1992 siege at Waco. Oops, sorry about that wording. Of a 1992 siege and the Waco siege. That's just the Waco incident that they were very angered by. So the result is they decided to bomb a federal building for revenge. They're like, it was a federal group, ATF, and the FBI, a federal group that was responsible for all of those people dying in Waco. So let's find a federal building and bomb it. And at one point, they thought about just bombing a building while it was basically empty. But then they decided, no, let's bomb it in the daytime when there are a bunch of people there. That will make the point a lot better. And they considered a bunch of different targets, and they finally decided on the Oklahoma City federal building. And the reason why, it had 14 different federal agencies there in that building, and also had an Army and Marine recruiting offices. And they used a car bomb, and they detonated the bomb on April 19th, 1995. So it was the 2-year anniversary of the Waco raid. And the result is they killed 168 people, they injured over 680 people, and they caused over $652 million of damage to buildings and cars within a 16-block radius. Um, they were caught not too long afterwards, and Timothy McVeigh was executed by lethal injection in 2001, and Terry Nichols is serving 169 life terms without parole. It was 161 life terms for some of the deaths, and then it was 8 more life terms for some of the other deaths. I forget why it was the two separate things, but yeah, so that was a major event of 1995. Then there's the Columbine High School shooting. And, oh, I don't have, do I have the date? Oh, I didn't get the date there. I should get that to you, though, just so that you have it handy. Let's see. I'm just pull that up just one second. Columbine High School shooting was April 20th, 1999. Yes, they were partially inspired by the Waco April 19th and by the Oklahoma City April 20th or April 19th, and they did this here on April 20th, 1999. And there were two high school students who, the short version of it is they murdered 12 other students at their high school and one teacher and wounded 21 others. Um, they had blogged about plotting violent acts. One of them, yeah, he had a video game related blog. I think it's related to Doom and Doom 2. And he started blogging basically just, stuff about how, like, this one particular kid in his school that he wanted to violently murder, and then other people that he wanted to kill. And then they also started to journal about their things like this and started to do stuff like turning in school assignments where it's a short story written from the perspective of a bullet as it kills people and a bunch of stuff like that. And their parents notified the sheriff's office when one of the parents of these two kids ran across the blog and was like, "This is disturbing stuff. We have to let law enforcement know what we're seeing this my child post online." There was an investigator who looked into it. He wrote an affidavit about what he saw, but for some reason he never submitted it to the sheriff's department. But then these two kids were caught breaking into a van and they stole and vandalized some stuff. No pun intended, vandalized. Anyway, and as a result of that, they had to enroll in this like diversion program and take anger management. And people were like, they did such a great job with these activities and with their anger management training. But meanwhile, they kept fantasizing in their schoolwork and with their journal, and they practiced detonating pipe bombs, and they got the weapons and everything like that. And yeah, so this is the first bad school shooting like that in relatively recent times, and it has served as kind of an inspiration for others to do similar things. Okay, next, George W. Bush. So he was the son of George H.W. Bush. Kind of his background, he had been governor of Texas before running for president and Republican. I'm realizing I should have put Democrat or Republican on these, but he ended up serving two terms as president from 2001 to 2009. So he's elected in the 2000 election. And that should say 2000 election. The 2000 election, one of the big things about it was the outcome of the election. He was running against Al Gore. The outcome of the election was going to depend on who won Florida. But there was disagreement about who won Florida because Florida was using these kind of punch card type of ballots where your ballot had like little pre-perforated holes, and you would use like a teeny little dowel kind of a thing that you would put on a little tray that had holes on it, and you would punch a hole in for like George W. Bush versus Al Gore, and you would punch a hole for the person that you were selecting. And they were it was a way to automate it to automatically count the results of the ballots. Well, there were a bunch of these ballots in Florida that weren't completely punched out, and they were what was called pregnant hanging chads and pregnant chads. And like a hanging chad would be if the little perforated part that was filling in the hole, if it was still dangling, if it wasn't completely separated, leaving a clean hole. And pregnant chads would be ones where it wasn't really separated at all, but it was kind of just it was bulging a little bit where the person apparently intended to punch a hole. And it went up to the Supreme Court of how do you count these hanging chads and how do you count these pregnant chads? And the way that the ballot counting ended up going, George W. Bush won the state of Florida. Al Gore lost, but there was a big stink about it because Al Gore had more of the popular vote than George W. Bush did. So it was one of the handful of times that a person ended up winning the presidential election, even though they did not win the majority of the popular vote, the majority of votes in the country. And a big thing of his presidency was the War on Terror, started after the 9/11 attacks, and huge popularity scores, approval ratings, that's what I mean, of how people viewed him in the aftermath of how he handled stuff immediately after September 11th, but then his popularity waned a bit after that. Number 16, September 11th, 2001, also known as the 9/11 attacks. I was in my, I think something like my second week of teaching high school in my first year out of college. And I had not been to New York City yet. I didn't know exactly what the World Trade Center was. I didn't know that these were buildings that were that huge. I mean, those are other huge skyscrapers in Manhattan. And the World Trade Center, they were at some point the tallest buildings in the world. Um, Two of them, huge, huge, huge office buildings. And there's a group called Al Qaeda, and they were or are Islamic terrorists, and they were founded by the group was founded by Osama bin Laden. Um, we'll get to a little bit more about Osama bin Laden later. There were 19 terrorists who hijacked four passenger airliners, so four airplanes, and of those four, two of them, the terrorists flew into these two buildings. One of them they flew into the Pentagon, and one of them had another intended target, but some of the passengers found out about what had happened to some other airplanes that day, and they partially took control of the airplane, and it ended up crashing out in the middle of a field. But the result of these attacks on this day was almost 3,000 deaths, 2,977 deaths, 25,000 injuries, over $10 billion in damage. I've talked to a firefighter chaplain who was there in New York at the time. Or no, he went to New York shortly after the time to serve as a chaplain to firefighters. And firefighters who went in while these buildings were still standing to try to see what they could do to help save people. They were wearing a type of tracker that if the tracker was getting weak, like if you passed out or if your heart rate dropped below a certain point, they would do this beeping, chirping kind of a sound. And there were a bunch of firefighters in those buildings when they collapsed. And as the results were going shortly after to try to uncover as much of the rubble as possible to try to save anyone if anyone was still alive, um, those who were trying to unbury the rubble were just bombarded by the sound of these chirps going off all over the place. And each one of those represented a firefighter who had been either buried alive or buried dead. And yeah, this guy that I talked to, he has a recording of all of those chirp sounds that were going on all over the place. Um, but these attacks on this day prompted the War on Terror, as it was called. So, the War on Terror. Al Qaeda, there were some of them in Yemen, and it resulted in the well, there was a war in Afghanistan that was fought against the Taliban. More about the Taliban in a little bit. That was from 2001 to the present. That war in Afghanistan is still kind of going on. There's a war in Iraq against Saddam Hussein. More about that later. It went on kind of from 2003 to 2011, kind of from 2003 to the present. There's the war against ISIS, the Islamic State in Syria, from 2014 to the present. And it also resulted in a bunch of different travel and surveillance agencies or changes, things like the Patriot Act, the Department of Homeland Security, the Transportation Security Administration. So, just as the name implies, it's a war not against a particular country, but a war against people within different countries who are hoping or wanting or trying to commit acts of terrorism, to commit acts of violence to push their ideology. So, one part of that is the Patriot Act, number 18, the Patriot Act, also known as the USA Patriot Act, where USA Patriot is an acronym for Uniting and Strengthening America by providing appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorism Act of 2001. And some of its main things that authorize some surveillance and information gathering without a warrant. It's like, oh, what if we have to move quickly? What if we think that this person might be a terrorist? Then we can like gather all sorts of information and track them without having a warrant against them, right? Like there was this one guy. He was from the Middle East. I forget where, and he was a professor at some American university. And he found out that he was on the somehow he had gotten on the United States terrorist watch list. And he was like, I have no ties with anything terrorist. I have nothing at all. I have no idea why I am on this terrorist watch list. So, what he ended up deciding to do is like, okay, if the government is expending resources on surveillance on someone like me, I am going to give them as much stuff to have for their surveillance as possible. So he started doing stuff like posting online a picture of every meal that he ate and a picture of the bathroom every time he went to the bathroom somewhere. I don't think he took a picture like of the inside of the toilet after he went to the bathroom. I think this is more like random picture of a bathroom, random picture of a bathroom. He was like, haha, Department of Homeland Security, waste time on this since you put me on your terrorist watch list for some reason. But yeah, so the Patriot Act, that was one thing about it. And the other thing is improved information sharing between government agencies. Different aspects of the Patriot Act have been shot down, and some are still being challenged because of violating constitutional rights of U.S. citizens because of circumnavigating certain aspects of things like due process. Another thing created as part of the war on terror was number 19, the Department of Homeland Security. And this is now the third largest in terms of amount of money that they spend, what their budget is, the third largest cabinet department. And its goals involve things like anti terrorism, border security, immigration and customs, cybersecurity, and disaster prevention and management. And then something created as part of the Department of Homeland Security is the TSA, also known as the Transportation Security Administration. And that is your video question number 4. Video question number 4, what does TSA stand for? And it's Transportation Security Administration. And again, this is part of the DHS, the Department of Homeland Security. And their main responsibility is to secure air travel with things like airport screenings and federal air marshals. Prior to 2001, you could like if your friend was flying, you could go with your friend all the way to the gate where you wait to get on the airplane, or if you were picking up your friend, you could go all the way to the gate to see your friend right when they got off the plane. The like body scanners and metal detectors were, well, they had metal detectors before that, but you didn't have to take your shoes off, you didn't have to take your belt off. All that kind of stuff is because of the TSA, because of the war on terror. And the taking your shoes off was because of a guy who one time tried to blow up an airplane because he hid some explosives inside the sole of his shoe. And a fellow passenger on the airplane noted this guy trying to use a cigarette lighter on his shoe and somehow like notified someone or put a stop to it. And because someone tried to hide explosives inside their shoe one time, now you have to take your shoes off when you go through security. Uh, the belt is, well, I'm not sure if it's related to this, but so he was a shoe bomber. There was another person that was known as the underwear bomber because he hid some explosives in his underwear. And he tried to blow up the plane, by trying to, well, I think he did end up successfully lighting his underwear on fire, but thankfully the explosives didn't go off. Thankfully, because of the underwear bomber, even, okay, shoe bomber resulted in take your shoes off when you go through security. Thankfully, the underwear bomber did not result in take your underwear off when you go through security. But they do use the body scanners. Some people don't like the body scanners because they're like, we don't like the radiation. But guess what? The same type of rays that you get radiated with the body scanner, you get high doses of them because of being high up in the atmosphere in an airplane. I think the amount of rays that you get from the body scanner is the equivalent of like 2 minutes of flying at like 30,000 feet elevation. But another concern that people have about the body scanners is they create basically three-dimensional imagery of your naked body. And at least early on, the companies who were making these were not careful enough about security and what would happen with the images. And yes, you had stuff like groups of personnel just, gawking at basically body scans of naked people. So that's an issue to be dealt with. It has largely been dealt with, but there's still, I don't know, just people do bad stuff sometimes, and they have that kind of information at their disposal, or also like the pat downs of searching people. But the another big thing is trying to throw technology at an issue. The number one threatened airline in the world is Al El. It's the Israeli air. What am I trying to say? Airline, and because they are under constant threat by all of the Middle Eastern countries that surround them. And the former head of security of Al El, has spoken about how the TSA operates and their approach. And he says it's not very effective, and it's kind of a waste of time and money, the people's time of all the security measures and the yeah. He says how we do it with Al El is we very highly train people to just briefly interact with each passenger as they're checking in. So they're like three different times when like you hand a person your passport or your ID and they ask you a couple questions. And then like you drop your luggage off and they ask you a couple questions. And you go through like one other thing and they ask you a couple questions. Like these people are very highly trained to read a person's reactions and how they answer questions and what they act like. And we catch things based on the interactions with people. And it's just a pleasant, like, ask you a couple questions about your trip. And it's like, so we catch stuff like this girl was dating this guy and she didn't know it, but he was a terrorist. And he had slipped some explosives into the bag that she was checking and she didn't know it. But through just the few interactions with her and asking a few questions, they deduced that there was something off with like who she was dating or some anyway, they were able to figure out, and it was stuff that security wouldn't have caught the way that the United States does it. And he was saying the United States should get rid of all of its like technology and all of their pat downs and their body scanners, and they should just train people to ask questions and know how to read people, is what he said. All right, final slide here. Number 21, the war in Afghanistan. So again, this was going from 2001 to the present. It's not officially over. It's known sometimes as Operation Enduring Freedom, sometimes also known as well. That was like the original invasion to overthrow the Taliban, and then now it's known as Operation Freedom's Sentinel as we're trying to maintain control in the country. And again, the main thing was to drive the Taliban from power and deny Al Qaeda a safe place. So Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden had been apparently been given kind of a safe haven in in Afghanistan and the United States. Well, so Taliban, originally supported by the U.S. in the Soviet-Afghan War. So the Soviet Union tried to take over Afghanistan. The United States, in trying to keep the Soviet Union from expanding into Afghanistan, had given arms and training to a group in Afghanistan known as the Taliban. and they ended up imposing Sharia law, which is a strict law enforcement of different Islamic rules, and they were imposing Sharia law in about three-fourths of Afghanistan from 1996 to 2001. Then, after the 9/11 attacks, the United States found out that Osama bin Laden was in Afghanistan, and they said, "Hey, Taliban, turn over Osama bin Laden." Taliban said no. And so then the United States decided, okay, well, between Taliban giving safe haven to terrorists and Taliban itself just being a really bad organization that is ruthlessly ruling the country, let's go in and let's get rid of the Taliban from ruling Afghanistan. And so the United States and about 15 allies went to war in Afghanistan, overthrew the Taliban from overall ruling the country, and the Taliban held on to some sections of the country. And that's where the war is ongoing, is there's still some Taliban insurgents who are trying to take back some of the country. Osama bin Laden, I mentioned C numbers 21 to 16, but just a little bit about how things wrapped up with him. So he briefly studied in Cambridge, very well educated, very wealthy family, but just part of this death to America kind of a mindset. The United States stands for the West, and the West stands for Christianity and opposition to Islam, and they are infidels who deserve to die. And yeah, so he was in hiding in Afghanistan for a while, and then he ended up in Pakistan. And the United States found out where he was. They created a compound that was a replica of where he was for special forces to train an invasion to capture him. My brother in law actually knows the guy that planned the operation. This guy, just like that's part of what he does for the military, is he trains operations like that. He just has this ability to look at what the scenario is and to plan for every contingency that they need to have in order to make sure that the operation succeeds. And he can like draw up the plans for this like on the back of a napkin on an airplane. He can just be like, okay, well, let's see. Well, here's the compound. And so based on this, here's probably how many people they have. And based on how many people they have and what the layout of this place, you should have this many people here and this many people here and this many people here. These people should go first and these people should cover these people. And he can just like draft this kind of a thing in a matter of minutes and they work flawlessly. So the United States captured Osama bin Laden. There's still some questions about exactly why, but they apparently, I forget if they say that he died in the attack or if they executed him afterwards. And on a ship coming back to the United States, they dumped his body into the sea. But that's what ended up happening with him. All right, and then finally, for kind of this half of Unit 14, the Iraq War. So this kind of went from 2003 to 2011, and it kind of is still ongoing. The main players on our side, the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, Poland, and the Kurds. So the Kurds was an ethnic group in Iraq who were being persecuted by Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein was a dictator in Iraq. It's estimated that he killed around 250,000 Iraqis, most of them Kurds. He would do stuff like, oh, this village has a bunch of people who don't support me. Okay, I'll do a poison gas bomb attack over the village and just wipe everyone out. And they found a bunch of torture rooms that like his secret police would use to torture and kill people. He would send the military to round up and to kill mass numbers of people. There are different mass graves that were found. People were killed because their like group or their ethnic group were not supporting him. It's like, wonder why they weren't supporting him. So the reasons why the United States went to war, there was a little bit of we think maybe Iraq might be supporting Al Qaeda, and then also we know that he's a genocidal dictator, but also we think that maybe he has weapons of mass destruction, and this is Video question number 5. Video question number 5. What does WMD stand for? What does WMD stand for? It stands for Weapon of Mass Destruction. Weapon of Mass Destruction. So we knew that Saddam Hussein at one point did have massively destructive weapons because the United States had sold Iraq, well, not directly. They had helped make sure that Iraq was well armed when the United States was helping to support Iraq to fight against Iran in the 1980s or 90s. I forget when the Iran Iraq war was. But yeah, so it's like, okay, we gave military training and financial aid and kind of helped make sure that Iraq was well armed. So we know that they did have them. But then also, well, yeah, so the United Nations had multiple times sent inspectors in to inspect Iraq because there were sanctions against Iraq and they weren't supposed to have certain types of weapons, nor are they supposed to be trying to develop atomic bombs. And Saddam Hussein had not fully cooperated with that. And a bunch of, well, some intelligence agencies were pretty sure that he had weapons of mass destruction. He was just hiding them really well. And a variety of things like that played a role in the United States end up going to war against Iraq. It does appear that Dick Cheney, George W. Bush's vice president, and Donald Rumsfeld and a few others just kind of went into their offices when George W. Bush became president with a plan already to go to war against Iraq. But there were some indications that they thought that he had weapons of mass destruction, but none were found after going to war, and a lot of people really held that against George W. Bush and said, like, he lied about weapons of mass destruction, and so we shouldn't have fought this war. But Saddam Hussein was a terrible, ruthless person who had killed like 250,000 people. But well, there was a good amount of international support as well. But anyway, so we ended up securing the country pretty easily, but the aftermath of maintaining control of the country did not go very well for a few reasons. One of them is we severely underestimated what the infrastructure in the country was like, what kind of condition the roads were in, what kind of condition the electrical grid for providing electricity to the cities in the country, a bunch of stuff like that. What kind of condition the telephone lines were in, and we thought that it was in better shape than it was, and also did not do a cool move when a bunch of people who had fought in Saddam Hussein's military just because they had been threatened with death if they didn't. After the war, a bunch of them came saying, "Thank you for liberating our country. Can we help you fight against Saddam Hussein's supporters?" And the guy, there was a civilian who was put in charge of all of this stuff afterwards. This guy basically said, hey, tell everyone if you fought in Saddam Hussein's military, we will not accept your help. No, thank you. And so what happened was all these guys, all these Iraqis who didn't like Saddam Hussein and wanted to help fight against Saddam supporters were told, because you were on his side, we don't want your help. So, oh, and by the way, you were being paid to be soldiers in the army. Now we're saying, no, go home. You don't get a job, but you still have your weapon. And it just created just a lot of ill will for people who otherwise would have helped support, and a variety of things like that made it so that the securing did not go very well afterwards, and it's part of why it keep kind of dragging on to this day. So yeah, that takes us up through that stuff, and then we'll tackle the second half. I think the second half will go a bit quicker than this did. I don't know yet how long this was, but I try to keep these quick while still not making it so just like skimming the surface that there's nothing interesting that we're talking about. It's just like a bunch of random terms with no content to it. But anyway, yep. So we'll do the second half next time, and I think it'll be a little bit quicker. Have a good day.